The previous lesson spent some time talking about social changes during the reign of Nicholas II. This lesson is going to follow that similar line of inquiry, but focus specifically on the ideas and ideologies associated with opposition to that of Nicholas II, including liberal opposition, the idea of demands for constitutional reform, as well as individuals, radical groups, and Marxist organizations, specifically the more radical groups that, of course, will pose the most significant threat when we talk about the First World War. So let's begin first then with liberal opposition and the demands for constitutional reform. Now, essentially, when we started our analysis of Nicholas II, we noted that there was a backlash to the idea of reform, and we see that Nicholas reigns, firstly, very inexperienced. He came to the throne at only 26 years old, but he reigns as an individual who is really following in the footsteps of his father, somebody who was an autocrat and sought to maintain autocracy, maintain ethnic unity, and maintain repression and the complete rejection of any kind of liberal reforms to the Russian state. Liberal opposition to Nicholas II then centered around the lack of political reforms that it basically carries on from his father, the absence of civil liberties, and the autocratic nature of his rule. Russian liberals were influenced by the ideas of constitutionalism and the demands for and the desire for a constitutional monarchy to those in Western Europe, particularly Britain and France. Liberals advocated for the establishment of constitutional government with limited monarchy. Sometimes we call this a constitutional monarchy. They demanded the establishment of a representative parliament, the protection of civil rights, the development of the rule of law. They believed that Russia needed reforms to modernize in order to be able to compete with European nations. Now, ultimately, we can see that Russian liberals formed various different political groups. We have, for example, the Cadets, the Constitutional Democratic Party, who pushed for reforms which included universal suffrage, civil liberties, and a national parliament. They were inspired by the ideas of Western liberalism and believed that autocracy was an outdated concept. We can see that, of course, the 1905 revolution was a significant moment in the achievement of some piecemeal liberal reforms. While initially sparked by economic grievances and worker unrests and the sort of legacy of the Russo-Japanese War, the 1905 revolution also saw demands for political reform. And so the October Manifesto of 1905 did grant limited civil liberties and theoretically did create a national parliament, a state Duma. But the state Duma, of course, was not really meaningful in any sense, and Nicholas was reluctant to implement any meaningful reforms, and we see that the Duma remains under Tsarist control, leading to disillusionment. A famous example is this of the representative liberal opposition to Nicholas's rule in the famous writer and prominent liberal politician Vladimir Nabokov. Nabokov criticized the Tsarist regime for its backwardness, its lack of political freedoms, a sentiment echoed by many liberals within Russian society. So the liberals were a significant threat to Nicholas II, but they were probably not as significant as the more radical groups. Socialists opposed Nicholas II primarily because of his regime's exploitation of the working class and the peasantry, as well as its failure to address widespread poverty and inequality. Ultimately, then, when we think about socialist ideas, the socialists believed in the need for a society in which the means of production are controlled by the working class, eliminating the idea of capitalist exploitation. So the basic tenet of socialism is this idea that there are means of production, there are essentially the things that you need to produce goods in a factory. So, for example, the raw materials, the electricity, the land itself, okay? And one of those means of production is the labor, okay? And one of the ideas is that labor presents or imbues raw materials with value. The raw materials in and of themselves aren't as valuable as the final product that is created in a factory from those raw materials. And so what happens there? Well, ultimately, labor is used to create value. This is known as the labor theory of value. Now, the idea behind socialism is that there are people who will essentially sell their labor as a means of production. They will sell their labor for a wage. And the people who own the means of production, the factory owners, will exploit that labor and make profit. If we get into sort of the sort of nitty-gritty philosophical conversation about from Marxism, you get this idea of alienation of one's labor, and you get this idea of class consciousness developing. But ultimately, the idea of socialism is that why don't the workers just take the means of production, and we won't need the capitalists anymore. You won't need the capitalist exploitation. They will own the means of production, and they will be able to work for themselves. The practical implementation of these ideas, though, of course, were a little bit more pragmatic. So the workers' movements and the socialist movements at the time called for the improvement of workers' rights, better wages, and the reduction of aristocratic power. While some socialists, particularly the group known as the Mensheviks, advocated for gradualist reform, the Bolsheviks, of course, believed in more violent necessary revolution. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, then, was divided into these two factions. You have the factions of the Mensheviks on the one hand, and you have the Bolsheviks on the other. Both groups opposed Nicholas II's autocracy, but had different approaches when it came to trying to achieve the goals of the working class. The Bolsheviks, led by people like Vladimir Lenin, believed in a proletarian revolution. They believed in the overthrowing of the Tsarist regime. Whereas the Mensheviks were a little bit more gradualist. They approached it from a gradual perspective, looking to work within the system. The 1905 industrial workers went on strike, the 1905 revolution. And during that time, as we noted, the first Soviets, the first workers' councils, were formed in cities like St. Petersburg. This was a direct challenge to Tsarist authority, and many of the demands were for simply better conditions, wages, and political freedom. Vladimir Lenin himself, the leader of the Bolsheviks, was an ardent critic of Nicholas II and the Tsarist regime. For example, in 1902, he wrote a work titled What is to be Done? In this work, Lenin critiqued the Tsarist autocracy for maintaining the political and economic power of the ruling elite at the expense of the working classes. Ultimately, then, throughout this entire working class movement and the socialist ideas, we do see clearly that Marxism and revolutionary ideology are shaping these movements. Marxism, as theorized by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, posited that history is shaped by class struggle, and that the ultimate goal was to overthrow capitalism and to establish a classless society. And so from that perspective, Marxism viewed the idea of the Tsarist system as a form of feudalism or early-stage capitalism that needed to be replaced by socialist revolution. The Marxists saw the working class as a vanguard of the revolution, which would dismantle the existing social and political structures. We can clearly see that the Marxist ideas will become very, very prevalent when we get to 1917. During the February Revolution, for example, we can see that there are mass uprisings which lead to the eventual abdication of the Tsar. But then when we get to October 1917, Lenin's Bolsheviks play a central role in the creation of the Soviet state and of the Soviet Union. More on that in future lessons. But ultimately then, what we start to see is that in addition to liberal and socialist ideas, we get more radical groups and underground groups. Radical opposition often took the form of a more extreme, sometimes even violent ideology. So anarchist movements and populist movements were among the most radical of in terms of opposition to Tsarism. Anarchists rejected both the Tsar and any form of centralized authority, calling for the complete abolition of the state. Populists that were inspired by the ideas of the Narodniks believed that Russian revolutionary potential of the peasantry existed. And we know already that things like the groups like the Social Revolutionary Party had very radical factions. One of such, obviously, in fact, led to the assassination of Alexander II. The radical wing of the Social Revolutionary Party, led by figures like Viktor Chernov, advocated for the assassination of prominent Tsarist officials. For example, the Social Revolutionaries were responsible for numerous acts of violence, including the assassination of the Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich in 1905. By contrast, then, you can see that the anarchist groups, people like Mikhail Bakunin, should I say, for example, and Peter Kropotkin, were critical of Nicholas's autocratic rule. And they gained popularity in the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly among students, workers, and intellectuals. So ultimately then, in sort of conclusion, we can see that the opposition to Nicholas II was increasingly complex. It was increasingly growing from a working class perspective and growing into a far more radical movement. It would take something like the First World War to essentially bring about the results that we see with the revolutions of 1917. And so that's why we're going to talk about the First World War, the state of Russia during the First World War, in the next lesson.